Okay, good evening, everybody. It is so wonderful to welcome you tonight to this town hall. I'm Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, proud to represent Washington's 7th Congressional District, and we have an incredible panel with us tonight. I want to thank you for taking what I know is precious time away from your families and from whatever else you have to do to join us for a very important discussion about an absolutely critical topic, a topic that I and our phenomenal panel tonight have spent, frankly, most of our careers thinking about and working on and living in, and that is white supremacy. It is cruelly ironic and horrifyingly symptomatic that we are having this discussion today on the day when the FBI arrested 13 people who were engaged in a months-long plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer of Michigan, overthrow the government, and put her on trial for treason. Investigators found that the men's mission is what white supremacist groups call the Boogaloo, described as an uprising or a second civil war. Let us be very clear. Some of these very individuals appear to be the very same individuals that participated in a storming of the Michigan State Capitol with swastikas and assault rifles and a brown-haired doll with a noose around her neck to represent the governor back in April, just after President Donald Trump tweeted, "Liberate Michigan." These are the same people that Attorney General Bill Barr claimed in my questioning of him to know nothing of, even as the Attorney General tear-gassed Black Lives Matter protesters in front of the White House for a photo op and sent federal troops into Portland and Seattle without her consent. And today, the President of the United States has still not condemned white supremacists. Tonight, I hope we can have a frank discussion about where we are in this country today. The Department of Homeland Security just released a long-delayed report 2 days ago that names violent white supremacy as, quote, the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. For too many of our communities, this assessment does not come as the surprise that perhaps it does for others. This summer, the protests following the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minneapolis, of Breonna Taylor murdered in her sleep in Kentucky, and many, many others, awakened many parts of a nation that has been asleep for too long. But we know that the legacy of white supremacy is as old as the founding of our democracy, and its whistles and whispers have become loud screams out of the shadows enabled by the past 4 years of Donald Trump's administration. We know that white supremacy is something that is unleashed not only in the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Tatiana Jefferson, Charlene Lyles, the list goes on, and so many more who should be alive today. It is also present in the deadly anti-Semitic violent attacks on synagogues, like the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018. It is present in the hate crimes on the Muslim community and the Muslim bans and the violence and fear and Islamophobic actions and rhetoric seen all the way from since September 11th, 2001. White supremacy is present in a for-profit immigration detention system that subjected immigrant women that I visited with recently in Irwin, Georgia, to invasive and unnecessary medical procedures, including forced sterilizations. It is present in the staggering disparities in the rates of COVID-19 deaths, 10 times higher for Black people than white people. It is present in Donald Trump's almost every words and references, including when he calls COVID-19 the China virus or the Kung flu. It is present in the hate crimes and the violence committed against every one of the communities that we'll be hearing from tonight. There's a history that we have to acknowledge, the original sins of slavery and colonization, enslavement, and attempted genocide of Native Americans and Black Americans. There's a history to acknowledge of the brutality of lynchings and Jim Crow laws, of law enforcement that was built to stop Black Americans from seeking freedom. There's a history of a war on drugs, exclusionary redlining, racial wealth gaps, school to prison pipelines, and so much more of our systems and institutions. There's a history of people facing execution simply for their religion and finding refuge here in America, but still facing the religious discrimination, stereotypes, and bigotry, harmful media stereotypes and misinformation for every group that seemed on the outside. The struggles of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and anti-Blackness are different, but they are interconnected. What they have in common is that they all rely on the scapegoating and fear of an other. They prey upon economic insecurities and thrive under our capitalistic ethos of individualism and me-first culture. A feeling of lack and scarcity, a feeling that there's not enough of the American dream to go around. But to really slay the dragon, we have to truly understand what we're fighting against in a deep way. And that's why I'm so glad that Aneelah and I were able to put this together, and why we're so blessed to have Dr. Kelle Brown with the Plymouth Church, Eric Ward, the Executive Director of Western State Center, and Rabbi Yohanna Kinberg with Congregation Kol Ami for this conversation this evening. I know that my constituents in this district care deeply about this topic, and your curiosity and compassion are among the reasons that I'm so proud to represent this district. So I want to talk about anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Blackness as their own separate, very specific demons, but also recognizing that white supremacy is a thread that runs throughout. And lots of folks can claim more than one marginalized identity, and we can't separate them. So with that, I want to start by asking each of our phenomenal panelists to introduce themselves and share why you're joining with us tonight. Aneelah, Executive Director of MAPS AMEN, Reverend Dr. Kelle Brown, Lead Pastor at Plymouth Church, Seattle, Eric Ward, Executive Director of Western State Center, and Rabbi Yohanna Kinberg, Congregation Kol Ami. Aneelah, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Thank you so very much, Congresswoman Jayapal, and all the people who have joined us for this conversation. It is always an honor to stand and be present with my fellow sisters and brothers in the struggle for justice. And Congresswoman Jayapal, you have been a true advocate, leader, and visionary in sort of combating these various forms of hate and injustice in our country and beyond. I want to say that I'm grateful that we're convening this kind of conversation, this much needed discussion, even though obviously I wish we did not have to. It is so important for us to be able to have this dialogue in the context of white supremacy. And it's something that we've only recently been able to publicly and openly say in places like, from the pulpit, from elected leaders, in sort of mainstream conversation and dialogue. For far too long, we haven't actually named white supremacy as the source of a lot of these various forms of hate and prejudice and oppression that many different communities are facing, whether we're talking about Black and brown communities, whether we're talking about Muslims and Jews, whether we're talking about so many different groups that are affected by the very vile consequences of white supremacy. And we need to be able to understand how our country was built on this, that it started from the original sin that my dear brother, gosh, I'm forgetting his name right now.
And Wallace.
Jim Wallace, thank you. Yes, Reverend Jim Wallace identifies as the original sin of our country, and that is white supremacy. And one thing that I've said is maybe the pandemic, the COVID pandemic that put us all in our homes, put this lockdown on, affected us, increased the temperature on all of us. Maybe that was a way for us to be able to finally speak out vocally and loudly and out on the streets and out in our homes and from the pulpits and everywhere else against this other form of pandemic that has existed for 400 200 years and has continued to kill and maim and murder and attack and hurt so many of us, far more than COVID even. And I also want to say that it's so important to have this conversation around election time, because we know that these various forms of scapegoating, of hate, of prejudice increase with elections. So that's why I'm happy we're having this conversation. It is an honor to be here. And I look forward to actually engaging in this discussion of how these various forms of oppression are connected and what the root is and how we address it.
Wonderful. Reverend Dr. Kelle Brown, you want to introduce yourself and say a few words next?
Thank you, Congresswoman Jayapal. I am always delighted to be with you. Thank you for being so clear, for being so intelligent. We appreciate your brilliance, but for also being willing to say what needs to be heard. And we just look forward to continuing to be the wind beneath your wings as you continue to be a light for not only Washington, but for this country. Thank you for who you are and what you do. I am so grateful for each of you who are watching as well, because this is a conversation that we must have. We must say that we are in crisis. For some reason, there is something built into our culture that doesn't want for us to say it, but we must say it if we are to indeed say that we're all on the same page and in the same fight together. We need to hear it. We need to resist staying comfortable. For while we do so, there are so many of us who are harmed by our silence. And we need to understand that institutionalized and systemic racism, and more specifically anti-Blackness, has been a lethal and debilitating lived reality for too many of us for too long in this country. And though many believe that the scourge of anti-Blackness was somehow killed with the emancipation of enslavement, or even perhaps with the legislation that happened in the 60s for civil rights, too many of us are still waiting for human rights, to simply be alive and to breathe. And the boogaloo is real. We found this out today. The sterilizations, like those that were lifted up by Fannie Lou Hamer, which she called Mississippi appendectomies, because they were so prominent and happened so often, they are happening. Legalized lynching is happening. And while some Americans tonight are standing down and standing by, we are to stand up in righteousness and understand that if we don't have this conversation, we can't get to a place of healing. We have to understand that when these things are happening, when a Black person is shot, like Breonna Taylor was shot, or when a person dies of a broken back, like Freddie Gray in the back of a police van, or when a chokehold, a person that dies by chokehold, like Eric Garner, or under the knee of George Floyd, rather than compassion and a clarion call that not another Black body will be on the streets, often we are hit with a hit job against those people to determine that they somehow deserve their deaths rather than admitting the evil. And it's until we undo this kind of blaming and shaming and stigmatizing, which is really propping up whiteness, until we undo that, we can't have the conversations that will lead for this country to truly experience the equity that we all long for. And so somehow I just want to lift up that there is ignorance and there is willful ignorance. And James Baldwin said it best: ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. So somehow together, our conversations here are trying to combat ignorance, but also to help for our hearts to open and to understand that until we have the conversations together, and also have the moral will to undo whiteness that is locked up in some of us, we can't move forward. So I thank you for the conversation tonight, and I look forward to how we will be together.
Thank you, Reverend Brown. Our next panelist is somebody who I started working with right after 9/11, and it's so wonderful to see him tonight here. Eric Ward, please share a little bit about your opening thoughts with us.
Congressmember Jayapal, it is such a pleasure to be with you tonight, and I'm so thankful for you and your office for the work that you have done to advance economic justice and social equity. Again, my name is Eric Ward. I'm Executive Director of Western State Center. I'll start my comments off tonight with some reflections. We find ourselves in a very serious moment. We know, according to studies, that in 2019 alone, far-right attacks in the US quadrupled. We also know, according to the Anti-Defamation League, that in the year 2017, there was a 182% increase in the number of distribution of incidents of white nationalist propaganda. We can look from Poway to El Paso to Pittsburgh and understand that it's not merely a rise in propaganda or rallies, but also violence. Hate crimes are on the rise, targeting Asian Americans, Muslims, Jews, African Americans, immigrants, and Latinos. Wherever we look around the country, we see the rise of intolerance. It is something that we have to contend with. Mostly in my organizing, I have mainly had to contend with institutional disparities, which are a burden unto themselves. Dealing with racial disparities and unconscious bias that deny opportunity to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. But we now have to contend with a new phenomenon, and that phenomena is this, that we are no longer the only social movement on the terrain of change in America, and that there are other social movements that are not grounded in inclusion, but exclusion. And the white nationalist movement is the most profound. It has had a significant impact, shaping conversations around immigration, from issues of exploitation to criminalization and removal. It has created the narrative that has allowed the passage of policies that have demonized our Muslim American neighbors. What we know is that the white nationalist movement is not merely individuals riding around in pickup trucks with shotgun racks on the back. That these are individuals who are now infected our body politic. And it's not simply the white supremacy of old. This is something new, something we need to understand. If white supremacy of the old was about exploitation, white nationalism is about ethnic cleansing and removal. We should not buy into the propaganda of MAGA and Make America Great Again. The white nationalist movement has no intention to taking America backwards, but it tends to try to collapse the United States government in order to institute its own white nationalist ethno-state. These are the challenges before us. But I think we have to remember something else tonight, that this white nationalist phenomena that we are contending with right now is the result of our victories. And it's a sign that we are winning the struggle to ensure that everyone has the right to live, love, and work free from bigotry and fear. It's not a revolution, but a backlash. And as we contend with the white nationalist movement, we need to move out of the binary. The idea that we are choosing either addressing longstanding white supremacy at the cost of ignoring white nationalism or vice versa. We are creative communities. We are communities that understand the importance of inclusion and the importance of belonging. We can contend and must contend with both phenomena. We contend with white supremacy so that we open up opportunities and alternatives to exploitation. And we contend with white nationalism because we remember the 75 years of civil rights struggle that has occurred in this country. And we remember our ancestors who struggled so hard to get us to this point. White nationalists seek to turn back the clock. And this is our time to honor those who came before us by rejecting that, by advancing the idea of whether you are a 17-year-old trans Latina in Seattle, Washington, or a 74-year-old white retired veteran in Eastern Washington, that both have the right to live, love, and work free from fear. We say that without apology. And we say that we have to manage and contend with this white nationalist movement because it seeks to detour us from getting into the promised land. I'm excited to be part of this discussion tonight about what we can do around the white nationalist movement. And it starts with us looking in the mirror.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Eric. And now our final panelist, Rabbi Yohanna Kinberg. Rabbi, please. I think you may be on mute.
The other panelists spoke so eloquently and made so many important points. Eric, thank you, and Aneelah and Reverend Kelle, thank you all for your wisdom and incredible intellectual and spiritual articulation of what's going on in our country right now. I grew up in Eugene, Oregon. That's where I first met Eric when we were both young people. And my father was the rabbi there growing up. And our synagogue and my family were the targets of neo-Nazi activity for most of my childhood, including the shooting up of our synagogue, stealing of our Torahs, hate mail threats. That was a part of my life as a child. And I understood that as, I live in an area and I'm growing up in a place where there's not a lot of diversity. This was in the 80s and 90s. And that there are these fringe groups that live out in the Northwest, Idaho, Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington. And knew and sort of entrusted that the FBI and our government were monitoring these extremist groups and were doing everything they could to keep my family safe and other people safe. And then Charlottesville happened, and I saw people marching through the streets chanting, "Jews will not replace us," and waving Confederate flags. And I started to see lots of Confederate flags in Olympia and along I-5, and I wondered, what is going on? I don't think I couldn't articulate several years ago white supremacy. I didn't have the language and I couldn't put all the pieces together. So our family got in the car and we drove to Charlottesville, and we walked the streets and we looked at the synagogue and we looked at the Confederate statues, and we went to whether Heather Heyer was murdered. And it became very clear to me that this is not about the South, and this is not about the Pacific Northwest, that this is a national movement that is probably in every town and every county, and that there is a great division happening in our country. And unfortunately today made that even more stark, that we are living in very troubling times. And I know that many people in my community, we're just less than 100 years out from a massive genocide of our people, are terrified. People are terrified because we're living in the context of terrorism, and it's unacceptable and it has to change.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. So let's start by just talking about how these systems, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and anti-Blackness, are used as tools of white supremacy and how they're interconnected. I would love to hear any of your thoughts in any order on that question as we think about these connections and interconnections.
I just think of growing up. I heard often from the pulpit in Columbus, Georgia. I was born and raised in the South. And I heard often that a house divided itself against itself will fall. And one of the things I know is that there is a sinister way that whiteness has tried to impose individualism upon Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks and folks of all sorts of identities, so that it feels like you must be insular and only concerned about your personal concerns or the concerns of your community. However, I think there's nothing further than the truth, because if I am not allied with Aneelah and standing with her against Islamophobia, I'm not able to fully stand against anti-Blackness. And I will not have built the coalition or the solidarity that's needed for all of our standing against what the forces of evil that are in the world. If I am not there for Rabbi Yohanna and saying emphatically that anti-Semitism is absolutely an evil and wrong, then somehow I feel that what I am doing for myself is not complete. So we have to understand that what Martin Luther King Jr. said was absolutely true, that all people are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, that we're all tied in a single garment of destiny. And so whatever affects me affects you. And until we have that kind of connection and that kind of solidarity and that kind of awareness that spurs us to the kind of action that's going to undo and dismantle whiteness, then I'm not sure we are truly doing any work that will be effective in the context of this nation.
So you spoke beautifully about the interconnected piece. How are these things used as tools of white supremacy?
Someone else?
They're manipulated, right? So I think about it in this way. And here's a good example. Right now, this country is experiencing demographic change. And different demographic change is changing the makeup and the face of America. People have something called anxiety towards demographic change. It's actually quite natural, right? If you walk into a room full of strangers, you actually have experienced demographic anxiety, right? Or if you've walked into a house of worship that you're unfamiliar with, you've experienced that demographic anxiety. There's nothing wrong with that. And what we know throughout history and through studies is the more that we build community intimacy, right? Or racial intimacy, right? Or religious intimacy, that demographic anxiety actually lessens and lowers. It becomes less important to folks as they become more familiar. What white nationalists have done is that they've been able to tap into the ways that white supremacy has manipulated demographic anxiety. White supremacy manipulated demographic anxiety by assigning to each of us a primary identity, and usually on the idea of reinforcing bias within society. Now, none of us are responsible for that. None of us created that unconscious bias. It was created, over 100 years ago, 300 years ago. But it still is the way that we walk through society. Now, white nationalists then take that demographic anxiety and that unconscious bias, and they turn it from something that's natural and tell people that it's a threat and that it's an existential threat. Mm-hmm. And they frame it not as something that occurs in societies, but as something that is akin to warfare. The war on immigrants, the war on Muslims, the war on gays and lesbians. It is how white nationalists have tapped into some of our deepest fears. And when we have some in national leadership who seek to stoke those fears in order of political gain, then we have disasters that we have witnessed, whether it is in Michigan or El Paso or Poway. It is the combining of state unconscious bias with a social movement that is fomenting its fantasy of race war. And people of color pay the price each and every day. Muslim Americans pay the cost each and every day. We see it in the hate crime statistics, and we see what happens when these white nationalist organizations arm themselves and start targeting victims.
One of the things you've raised is the issue of how we are pitted against each other, that can be done in, fear of the other. It's also done by pitting religions against other religions. And so I want to ask Rabbi and Aneelah to talk about this, because obviously Muslims and Jews are constantly pitted against each other within this country. And I think that there is a thread of white supremacy that runs through anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that we need to unpack here. And I'd like to ask the two of you to help us with that.
Do you want to go first, Rabbi, or should I?
Go ahead, Aneelah.
Okay, thank you for that question, Congresswoman. And absolutely, I mean, it is part of this divide and conquer that we were talking about that has been used throughout history. And part of the way that I explain it is that there are certain narratives that have existed in our country, and these narratives are based in white supremacy. And these narratives kind of are like similar scripts, where what all you got to do is change some of the characters and the labels, but the script is the same, and the end result is the same. And they're intentionally used in a way to paint certain people collectively in a way to demonize them, criminalize them, terrorize them, and murder them even at times, by the state even at times. And specifically when it comes to this divide and conquer approach, we see it explicitly happening today between Muslims and Jews, when in fact, when you look at the data and the information, I mean, first off, Muslims and Jews actually have relatively equal sort of positive views of each other. Somebody who is anti-Jewish is 32 times as likely to be anti-Muslim, and vice versa. There's direct interconnectedness there. In fact, one of the greatest predictors of Islamophobia is anti-Semitism. So these are forms of oppression that are absolutely and directly connected to each other. And there are Gallup polls and Pew studies and research by ISPU, Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, that go into all of these various connectedness between the Muslim and the Jewish community, and also the fact that the Jewish community has some of the lowest Islamophobia index numbers in our country because of the understanding that exists between Muslims and Jews. Unfortunately, because of political issues, you know, specifically Israel-Palestine, let's name it here, specifically because of that, and because of the vested interest that certain political powers have in that conflict and wanting a certain result. And I'm not talking just about Jews, I'm talking also specifically about evangelical Christians who have a certain narrative about what is going to happen in the end of times. And they have a certain reason to support Israel that is far from protecting Jews in our country, you know, in Israel or elsewhere. But because of that, there's this narrative that is promoted by the right in particular, but also by some on the left. I want to be very clear that many of these problems that we're talking about, whether it's Islamophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, you know, any of these, they unfortunately are bipartisan problems. You know, their manifestations may look different on the left versus the right, but they are bipartisan problems. But the way that it is exploited is there's this idea that, you know, Muslim women of color in particular, or other women of color in particular, or people of color in particular, are attacked with charges of anti-Semitism at times when they speak in support of Palestinian human rights. Or there are other efforts to try to demonize and attack Muslims, for instance, because of not wanting to garner support for Palestinians. Or there are other attempts to demonize Muslims in general and promote Islamophobia because we want support for some of our foreign policy, in particular our wars in Muslim majority countries. So that is part of the whole sort of premise of white supremacy, is this system that has throughout history has had a certain power structure that it wants to maintain, a certain white identity that is sought to maintain in our country. And anything that is other, you know, to that identity, whether it's Black, whether it's Muslim, whether it's Jewish, whether it's LGBTQ, any other is a way to try to create the divide and conquer between communities, so that we are busy fighting or attacking each other instead of looking at the power structures that in fact hurt us all. Whether those power structures and threats are coming from white supremacist individuals or groups that promote violence or engage in violence against both Muslims and Jews and Black communities and others, or whether we are talking about state-sponsored forms of aggression against people. And we're seeing that against Muslims, we're seeing that against people of color, we're seeing that against many communities as well. So either way, we are seeing these systems in place that promote hate, that promote Islamophobia, that promote, you know, different forms of hate and oppression for a certain political purpose. And this was also the very same kind of tools that were used throughout history to pit white people, working class white people, against Black people. In fact, the KKK was created initially to attack white people who were working with Blacks, not directly Blacks. And a lot of people don't know that. So it's this idea of constantly promoting infighting to keep us busy attacking each other, when in fact we should be natural allies, when in fact we can collectively build these movements that challenge institutions, that challenge power structures, that challenge those who seek to divide us. And I have more to say, but I'll stop there.
So beautifully said. Rabbi, jump in here.
I also see white supremacy as a narrative and a story that's told a million different ways a day on television, in movies, in the grocery store, you know, in schools, in textbooks. Wherever you look, there is this story we're constantly being presented with that President Trump laid out that story in his Republican National Convention speech, that white people came over here and built this nation and they created everything that's good about this country, and that the others that Aneelah just spoke of, this is not, the message is, this is not your home. You didn't build this, you didn't create it, you're just a visitor here, we're just barely tolerating you, you're leeching off all of our creation. And so that plays out all over the place, including in neighborhoods and the kind of demographic trends that Eric just spoke of. Just this past Shabbat, we were having a service Friday night, and one of the neighbors, we were outdoors, walked by and said the neighborhood is going to blanking Jews, and then turned up their radio full blast to drown out our service. Right down the street from us is a mosque, and the person across the street probably has about 5 huge Trump flags and Trump signs all over his house, right across the street. So that kind of white supremacist and anger, really rage, about the presence of people who they don't believe belong here and shouldn't have a home here, is so clear. It's been clear to me for a long time. It feels like their rage and their voices are getting louder. And my sincere concern is, especially in the Pacific Northwest, is that many of those who've been tasked with protecting us also have been very much seem to be convinced that it's Antifa and people on the left who are a threat to Jews and to others. And my experience is not alert enough to the white nationalist, white supremacist organizing in our area.
Well, of course, you know, some of that comes from the leadership, right? So we on the House floor last week, we passed a resolution not only condemning the forced procedures at Irwin Detention Center, but we passed another resolution right after that that was condemning QAnon. And, you know, if you look at the QAnon conspiracy theories, it absolutely combines white supremacy, anti-Semitism. It is really rooted in the midst of that. And I think I was struck by something that Eric said, that this is not the old, you know, this is an entirely new phenomenon. It's not the old, I forget how you said it, Eric, but I guess, you know, I see Confederate flags all the time now. I don't remember seeing Confederate flags going down the highway on I-5. I don't remember protests where it was regular to have swastikas proudly displayed. I mean, those were seen as sort of more isolated hate crimes. And so I guess the question I have for all of you is, what are the tools that people should use to call out white supremacy and to fight this? What are the things, because we're all organizers on this call, what are the things that we need for people to do and in order for us to help beat back this movement? And Aneelah, why don't we start with you on this one?
Sure. So specifically, I would say that there's a lot that we can and should do. One of the most important is make sure we are not silent in the face of this kind of hate being promoted, because if you ignore it, it's not going to go away. It just further festers and becomes a bigger and bigger problem. And we are seeing the manifestations of that today. And I have to say that specifically with this chaotic election and the likely chaos that's going to ensue following November 3rd, no matter who wins, is only going to be a recipe for greater sort of disaster in that kind of way. But before I go into specific tools, I want to mention too that even though it does seem very negative, very depressing, I know there's days that I have that I'm just like horrified and exhausted by everything. At the same time, we really have the power to make a difference. And as I think Eric said earlier, or somebody else, maybe Reverend Kelle said, we would not actually have this much sort of pushback. We would not see all of this if we were not making progress. Like, it is a constant pushback, progress, pushback, progress. So we really have to be pushing for the kind of change that we want to see. And the sort of national uprising that we have seen since George Floyd's murder gives us that opening that I hope we really take advantage of to create real change and real systemic change. But our tools, our specific tools for addressing these kinds of hate and prejudice and oppression and white supremacy, number one has to be about sort of educating ourselves, understanding the interconnectedness between these various forms of oppression. Because if you look at them in silos, you are not going to be able to defeat just one. If you can't get rid of the problem of Islamophobia if you're not also combating anti-Black racism, if you're not also combating anti-Semitism. These are directly connected. That's why I say this all the time, that in the work that I do combating Islamophobia, I recognize it is for our collective liberation, and also specifically that when I'm combating Islamophobia, I recognize that it doesn't just hurt me as a Muslim, it hurts all of us as Americans the very same way that all lives cannot matter until Black lives matter. That is a statement of fact for me, and it guides the work that I do. So we really need to educate ourselves and educate how these various forms are directly connected to each other and feed off of each other. So that's education. Number two, make sure that we call out and recognize the various ways that they manifest. And part of this is through double standards and how we talk about, violence when it is by white majority individuals, white supremacists or others versus Muslims, for instance. How we talk about criminalization when we talk about crimes committed by white people versus crimes committed by Black people. Understand those double standards that are at play, and also the collective blame that is used for perpetuating these forms of oppression. Number three, or part of this understanding the frameworks, is specifically understanding how we are talking far more than just individual forms of hate or bias or bigotry or ignorance. This goes much, much further than that. It really has to be looking at things at an institutional level, at a systemic level, and understanding the roots from there, because if we just stay at the individual level, we can't actually create the kind of change that we desperately need in our country to combat this kind of hate. And also important to recognize, as I said before, that this truly is a bipartisan problem. And part of recognizing that bipartisan problem is specifically being able to name the problem, calling out by name. If people are finally getting comfortable calling out Islamophobia and calling out white supremacy, we need to get comfortable saying those. And this narrative that has existed in our country about violence in particular has so long focused on Black and brown people, and specifically Muslims when it comes to terrorism, when in fact we know, throughout our country's history and even in modern history, the biggest source of threat in our country has been, in terms of mass violence, has been from white supremacists and anti-government separatists, even though Muslims or Black people or others are the ones that are constantly portrayed as the sources of violence or danger or threat in our country. Recognize how that is a narrative, and recognize how that framing is constantly used to de-emphasize and downplay violence by white supremacists, and not attribute collective blame to all sort of Christians or all white people when one Christian or one white person commits an act of violence or commits a criminal act. So understand that. Besides education and awareness raising within ourselves and our families and communities, we really need to call out the bigotry specifically. And on this call out, here's what I would say. Do not be worried about saying the exactly perfect thing, right? It's not about that. It's about speaking out and saying something, because I think a lot of us too often are worried about, I'm not going to say the right thing. I might be perceived this way, or I might be, I don't know enough to say something. Every single one of us has the power to say something. And what I tell people all the time is, instead of debating, instead of going on social media and arguing or anything else like that, all you got to do is tell positive, personalizing stories. Because no matter how much facts and stats and data I have and I can give to counter many of the false narratives that are constantly perpetuated in our country, the facts and stats and data alone do not change hearts and minds. It really is about personal relationships, personal stories, connections. Those are the things that truly create a difference. And that's why we need more and more people to be out there telling those positive personal stories, because that is really what's going to potentially change hearts and minds. And especially on social media, ignore the haters, ignore the hate, ignore the negativity, just share positive positive information and then move on. Do not stay attached there, because you might sort of make yourself go crazy trying to just read and engage and constantly fight and battle on social media. But just share as much positive, personal, factual information that you can, and we can share many resources for doing that. But our voices and our values have to be louder than the very vocal, although very small minority of people who are the ones promoting violence, promoting hate in really vile and ugly ways. So that's another thing. And then one of the most important things, and this is the part that I really emphasize and that I work on personally every day, this is building coalitions and building movements. And those movements have to be, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multi-gender, every kind of way, multi-age, multi-generational, whatever we can, bring people together to stand in solidarity, because again, we cannot be in these silos, because we will die individually if we are in these silos. Politically, we will die if we remain in our silos. We have to build these movements and use the power of community organizing and those movements to change institutions, because I've said this before, none of our institutions will save us. Not the Supreme Court, not the president, not Congress, as much as I respect you, Representative. It's really up to us as individuals and as sort of communities. We have to be there to love and protect each other. We have to be there to make sure that nobody comes and strips any of us of our rights, of our right to dignity, of our life, of our safety and security and well-being. And as we are building these movements, we can actually address the underlying issues that are leading to a lot of these problems in society, whether they are things like healthcare, whether they are things like education, the racial gap in our country, whatever it might be. But we really need to be building those movements. And I have some other ideas, but I'll stop there.
You always do, and that's what I love about you, Aneelah. That's what I love about you. Eric, you've been a community organizer for a long time, and you're a senior fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center as well, working on hate and white supremacy. So give us your thoughts on tools that people can use to call this out.
I love hearing Aneelah's voice. So I just want to thank her for that and recognize that. Look, I'll say this really quickly because it can feel like a lot. So the first thing I want to tell folks to do is to take care of yourselves. And taking care of yourself just means realizing in this moment that all of us are carrying a lot, right? There is climate exhaustion. There is pandemic exhaustion. There is economic exhaustion, and the list goes on, right? We are dealing with a global pandemic that has killed over 200,000 Americans, right? Right now, 1 out of every 1,020 African Americans has died from COVID-19 in the last 7 months. And I'll say that again, 1 out of every 1,020. And the trajectory shows that left unchecked, right, that number will grow to 1 in 500. COVID is devastating. 51 million plus Americans out of work. So we have to acknowledge that we're carrying a lot and we're exhausted right now. So I need folks to first rest, drink lots of water, get sleep, right? Exercise, spend time with your loved ones and your friends, being grounded and just acknowledging that it's a heavy moment. I need you to also lean in, though. And leaning in, I'll just means, right? It means engaging, empowering, and enforcing. And to do that means we have to partner, right, with government at the federal, state, and local level, with our allies and leadership there, with city governments. We have to break this demographic anxiety fear that the white nationalist movement, right, is incubating and using to drive all of us, not just white folks against people of color, but Jews against Muslims, Black folks against immigrants. That engaging means dealing with the segregation in housing, transportation, education, and employment. Breaking down the walls of segregation allow us to build intimacy, and that takes policy. And that means working with elected officials to get that policy into place. Intimacy is our best defender against the white nationalist movement. But beyond engaging, there's also empowering. And that means investing in people, helping people understand that at the end of the day, white nationalists don't come into our town bringing anti-Semitism or homophobia or Islamophobia or racism or any other form of bigotry. They simply organize the bigotry that already exists. Empowering ourselves is how we inoculate ourselves against those who seek to manipulate, right, our unconscious bias. That means more conversations and trainings on reducing bias. It means spending time with neighbors who may not worship like us or have the same cultural, racial, or ethnic background. So beyond engaging and empowering, there's also enforcing. There are anti-paramilitary laws that are on the books. There are hate crime legislation on the books. We don't need new laws. We need to enforce the laws that already exist. And enforcing those laws also means opening up the civil remedies, holding people accountable, right, for their actions in civil court. Because let's be clear, simply sending folks to jail just makes them cooler and respected more. They're seen as martyrs. But we live in a capitalist society, whether some folks like it or not. And the truth is hitting people in their pocketbooks is how you catch their attention. It's how you remind them that they actually live in a society that is striving for the common good, that believes in the rule of law and will not be intimidated and will not allow any of its residents to be terrorized because of their race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, disabilities. So remember, engage, empower, and enforce. Those are the three things we can do. And local folks can do that as individuals by reaching out to your elected officials and educating them on this topic.
I really love the idea of intimacy as a weapon against white supremacy. I think that's a beautiful phraseology and concept. Rabbi, what tools would you advise people to sort of go to in order to fight white supremacy and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, all the things we're talking about tonight?
Well, in terms of tools, I'm thinking about also tools that we use to keep ourselves focused and driven towards creating a different storyline for our country. And, this is an amazing place. I can't be a rabbi in Israel in the same way I hear, or anywhere, really many places in the world. This country has offered me and my mother, who was a refugee from Morocco, so many amazing opportunities, including to live in an amazingly diverse and rich society. And so one of my tools, and something I really hope others will do, is have a vision of what can be, of what we're building. We have so many dystopian movies and novels, and it feels like we're living the dystopia, and it's really easy to lose a vision of the world that we want to create. So the next thing I do is ask people to look at the children in their family. And many of us probably have children, who I know I have Black young women in my family and Asian young women and men in my family, and we're Moroccans, and my family, and I'm sure many of your families, are very, very diverse. And so what world are we building for these children? It cannot be a world of white supremacy. That's not an option. Not for me, not for these children. And so I want to build on the America that I'm so proud of and has offered me so many amazing opportunities to have such a full life, and to keep everybody full of hope, because we can't do this without hope. I guess that's where the spiritual part comes in, is that after all the degradation and the terror and the murder and the humiliation, we have to rise up with hope. And all of you, each of you on this panel, give me hope. You fuel my hope.
Beautiful. Reverend Brown, you have a congregation that you are helping to get through these difficult times. Your church does so many things for the most vulnerable among us. what words do you have about tools that people can use to fight white supremacy?
I am so grateful to be a part of Plymouth Church, and we are being honest about who we are. We've done many things to uplift and empower, and we are struggling to figure out who we are for such a time as this. And so, of course, I'm asking people to Google the terms so that you know what racism really means, and to know systemic racism and the nature of, you know, all of the terms and what privilege means and all of that. We're reading James Baldwin, and we're reading Ibram Kendi, and you know, all of those things. However, I say that what Eric and Rabbi Yohanna and Aneelah actually drive me to is one of the tools that I have been promoting at Plymouth, but also promote to you tonight, is that we have to have an emotional intelligence, a moral intelligence, that we are called to be children of remembrance. So we can't start and step into a river and assume that it begins with us, but we have to look back to see that there have been many people who have done many things to make sure that this country is turning with an arc bent towards justice. We have to understand and remember, and not just begin now, so that young people aren't pulling out swastikas without knowing what it means, just wanting to be bullies and terrorizing, but they don't understand what it means for so many people here. We have to understand what the Confederate flag truly means, and that it's not about heritage, but it truly is about terror. We also have to understand and undo what we think about tool, because I want to say that it's time for us to call forward the Marvin Gaye's, because we need Mercy, Mercy Me. We need the music of Pete Seeger. We need the art. We need to have the Black joy. We need the double dutching. Hey, listen, I got over because I saw double dutching on my street. And I knew that if Black girls could jump like that, I could absolutely be the lead pastor at a mostly white church in Seattle one day. So those are the kinds of things. We need people who are doing the poetry. We need John Hargraves who are doing spoken word. We need to have people writing like James Baldwin and Maya Angelou and Toni Morrison. We need the movies. We need the documentaries. We have to understand that all of us aren't called to march. All of us aren't called to protest. All of us aren't called to demonstrate, but most of us have a skill, have a mouth, have a voice. We can use that for the betterment of this nation. And if we don't have those things, if we are not having the cultural revolution that will support what your work, Congresswoman, that will support all of our work in the community, then I'm not sure that we will have the fullness of what we need to get through.
I'm ready to write my song and dance my dance. I mean, I'm coming down, Reverend Brown. Well, let's move to audience questions. I know we have audience questions. And so McKenna, let me turn it over to you to facilitate that. I think these were submitted when people registered. So I'll let you talk us through that.
Great, thank you so much, Congresswoman. Thank you so much to all of our wonderful speakers this evening, and for everybody who joined us. We really appreciate you taking the time to be part of this conversation and for submitting so many thoughtful questions ahead of time. We'll get to as many as we can. The first one I'm going to start with is a question for Congresswoman Jayapal. We received several questions relating to the White House's plans to cut and prohibit diversity and anti-racism trainings for federal agencies. And so the question is, will Trump actually be able to cut these programs? And if so, what can we do about it?
I'm really having a hard time with answering some of these things because they are so ridiculous, if I can just say. I know that's not a very congressional answer, but technically, you know, I suppose the administration could try to outlaw these certain kinds of diversity trainings. They certainly could do that. Congress doesn't get engaged typically in exactly what those trainings are. And so there are both overt and covert ways to end those kinds of trainings, because as we all know, diversity trainings of any kind require that the people who are funding those and helping to make them happen believe in them. That's part of the problem when you try to do a diversity training, the person doesn't really believe in them. It doesn't really happen. It doesn't happen with the right people. It doesn't happen the right way. And so the bigger overriding question to me is about the white supremacist that is in the White House. I'm sorry to say that. But that is, to me, the bigger question that is at stake here. And so there are any number of things that he is trying to do, some of which will end up in the courts, like trying to designate Seattle as an anarchist city and trying to cut our funding. That is unconstitutional, but if he were to push it through, it would have to go through the courts and we would have to fight it in a legal battle. But the anti-bias training and the anti-racist training, my fear is that there will be just enough barriers so that people won't be able to do them, or they won't be able to do them well. And so we'll have to see. But I think, you know, this is obviously something that we're continuing to, there are a lot of places around the country that are continuing to do those trainings. In fact, we're doing one tomorrow within our staff. And it is on white supremacy and anti-Blackness and anti-racism. So, and I'm doing that on the official side, and it's funded by federal dollars. So let's see how far he gets with that. But, you know, I think we have a bigger issue the biggest issue here is that of the president himself and his refusal to condemn white supremacists.
That's right.
Thank you so much. The next question we have that's available for any of our speakers to answer is, we had a lot of people write in with a similar sentiment. And so that is, given the different approaches to addressing racial justice within the BIPOC communities, so for example, defunding versus abolishing versus working with police departments to address racial injustice, what role should historically white-led organizations play in supporting change without perpetuating further harm?
Who wants to take that? Eric?
I'll take that. Look, I think that there are a couple of suggestions here. We have to understand that at the end of the day, we have to make sure that those who have survived, right, decades and generations of unconscious bias, that their voices are heard and that their leadership is taken seriously. It doesn't necessarily put you, though, if you don't fit in that category, it doesn't relegate you to the sidelines or even to the back, though. There's still a lot of work to do. I'll just say this, right? We live in a region of the country, right, where for some people it still takes 2 or 3 hours, right, to be able to access a hospital in the case of emergencies. We live in a region where many people go hungry each night, right? We live in a region with chronic homelessness. There are a host of issues that we tackle. But if we don't tackle those issues, where do we provide the real alternative to the racial war, right? The white nationalist vision of the future that we seek to oppose. So yes, it may not be that you're doing the same work as organizations of color, but there's lots of work to do in our region, whether it's climate, health, economy, right? Or even just building the intimacy that's necessary for such a vast geographic region to get to know one another and to get us out of our ideologies and to begin centering the thing that actually brings us together, which are our values. And so what I would encourage organizations to do that are primarily white are 3 things. The first is to figure out how you engage a large white population, which you don't have to leave this region to engage. The second is, how do you strengthen relationships with organizations of color or organizations that are led by people of color? That may take a little bit more time, but that work needs to start today. The third is to start worrying less about our ideologies and start lifting up our values more. The values that most of us have in common. Most of us want to be safe. Most of us want a better future for our children. Most of us want opportunity. Those aren't political positions. Those are value positions. And there's some in our society, like white nationalists, who seek to divert us from understanding we have common ground through violence, harassment, and intimidation. In short, we got to keep our eyes on the prize.
Can I say really briefly?
Please.
Thank you so much, Eric. I just want to add to that, one of the things that predominantly white institutions can do is learn the power of silence and the centering of Black, Brown, and Indigenous voices. And also in doing that sort of centering, to deal with the bias overlay that perhaps what we're saying is not as intelligent or is based in something other. Somehow all of those things are going to have to go away if in fact we are going to center Black voices, especially around Black Lives Matter. We've got to undo all of these myths that are completely untrue, that do not allow for folks to hear or understand. And the other thing I want to say, and this comes from my own personal experience as a Christian minister, one of the things that I know is that the Gospel of John says that it was written so that we might believe. And one of the things that is a problem for predominantly white institutions is that they believe they are called to understand. But I want to say that no, they're called to believe that the terror is real, the abuse is real, the discrimination is real, that we have the history that we are saying is real, that what comes forward in Howard Zinn's and Ronald Takaki's and other alternative histories, those are recovered. They are not created. And so we have to be in a place where we believe one another, and therefore they can be effective in their work once they center and lift up and empower the voices that know best because they have been impacted.
Amazing. Aneelah, you look like you were going to say something, and you deal with a lot of coalition building. Did I see you wanting to chime in here?
I didn't necessarily want to, but I'm always happy to share, and I always have something to say. So I will say just quickly that there is specifically a Washington for Black Lives coalition that has been created. It's a statewide coalition that people can join. I believe the website is just washingtonforblacklives.org. And it is a way to follow the lead of Black-led organizations in some of the work specifically around investing in Black and Brown communities, defunding or demilitarizing police, and other things like that. So that's one specific resource for people, at least in Washington State. I'm also working on creating a coalition against hate in Washington State, because unfortunately we have had local examples of hate being promoted. And here's another instance where you see the interconnectedness between Islamophobia and anti-Black racism and more, you know, including by elected leaders or law enforcement specifically promoting anti-Black and anti-Muslim sentiments on social media and elsewhere, and wanting to expose those, and then also hold elected leaders and other leaders accountable when they fail to condemn by name some of these forms of oppression, some of these forms of Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, or more, because we've unfortunately seen that as a problem even locally in Washington State, in a liberal state. So that's something that I hope people sort of pay attention to. And I also wanted to just sort of point out that there are other coalitions across the nation, things like the Poor People's Campaign, that is really bringing people together, building the kind of movements that we're talking about. And all of this, including all the people on this panel and elected leaders like yourself, Congresswoman, they're what give me hope. They're what give me strength. Along with my faith, they give me the ability to continue doing the work that I'm doing and to not lose hope. And I have to say that sort of the powers to be, the power structure that works against us, you know, that has a system that was never meant for people like me to be in it or part of it, they would be ecstatic if we give up and sort of despair. That's why it's so important, as Reverend Brown said, to sort of celebrate, you know, have Black joy, have our moments of dancing and joy and happiness and self-care, as Eric said, even in the process of doing the kind of critical work that we need to do. It truly is an incredible time to be alive if we are able to look at the power and the role that we have and the shoulders of people, of the giants on who we stand. You know, like if we look back at history and see at what the problems people in the past faced, and they didn't give up hope, there's no reason that we should be giving up hope. We really need to continue to maintain that hope, and also, you know, keep it as part of our drive every single day.
Thank you so much. We have one more question from the audience for tonight, and that is for our panelists. Do you see this period of history as different from past efforts to deal with this issue?
I absolutely do. I think that we're really at a turning point. And one of the ways, I mean, just in terms of, you know, when you hold up your finger to the wind and, you know, feel what's going on, I know that within my own community, there are people who are really questioning because, you know, Jews have not been here for that long. It's like, is this our permanent home? And my answer is yes. We can't keep running from hate. It's time to stand up. And this country, I think, has our best opportunity as human beings on the globe to really turn our faces towards that hate and towards that white supremacy and coalition with each other, and all of our stories coming together, all our individual stories of people coming together and pushing back and saying, no, we're gonna stay. This is, you're not gonna run us out of this place. This is our home. And then also center Native voices too, and knowing that this was their home, and we are so lucky to be able to be here and you know, be welcomed onto their land. That's a powerful voice for our nation. There's a lot of strength in that. And so I absolutely, you know, think that we're at possibly a really amazing turning point where those voices come together as one.
Beautiful. Anybody else want to add on that?
I just want to say briefly that though our the occupant of the presidency will not say it, I will say that white supremacy is absolutely wrong, and I will stand against it. And there are so many people who are able to do that. That brings me hope. It brings me hope that somehow we are at a place and at a time where we are able to say, yep, we should absolutely be paying rent to the Duwamish. We need to honor that they no longer have the 54 acres that we enjoy. They have 3/4 of it, 1 acre, and that somehow we need to be offering rent. And in some ways, that's a building of solidarity. We need to understand that though we are here, as some others have said, my grandmother, she just passed away in May. However, she made it through the Depression. She made it through Jim Crow. She made it through the civil rights movement. She made it through when her relative would call and say, the Ku Klux Klan are rioting tonight, get home. She made it through all of that. She had Obama all over on the walls next to Jesus because she had finally seen in her lifetime an African-American president. And so there's a movement going around saying we are not our ancestors. I want to stand against that and say we are absolutely our ancestors. In the spirit of Sankofa, we're looking back, but we're also flying forward, and we are grasping on hope, knowing that it comes by way of all of the tragic that we pass by. So yes, it is the same, and it's also different. And I know right now that what we're hearing and what we're experiencing is actually the rattling of the death rolls of white supremacy as it dies before us. So we shouldn't be afraid. We should be helping it along. We should be hospice nurses for white supremacy, for it is dying with this presidency and absolutely dying in this generation.
I would just add on, I mean, I think all of us would reinforce this point. You know, we should remember, right? The majority of Americans did not cast their votes for Donald Trump. Don't believe the hype. Do not believe this. The majority of Americans, right, want to live in an inclusive democracy that is people-centered, accountable, and transparent. The majority of Americans want to wrestle with what it means to live in a diverse society that is free of unconscious bias. The majority of Americans don't wake up in the morning thinking about how to make the lives of Black people, immigrants, Muslims, Native Americans gays and lesbians, trans, like worse, right? And we have to remember that. And that has come through hard work through generations. And so I think we should remember we're winning, right? And so winning means that we have actually built many of the models. Now there's some ways we can add to this model. The first is we should remember that demographic anxiety is real, right? And it's quite natural. It's not the bad thing that we think it is, but it's bad if we don't use it as an opportunity, right, to compete for the same constituency that white nationalists are competing for, which is white people. We need to open up our movements. They are broad enough to contain everyone in America. We don't get to the promised land unless we bring everyone into the promised land. And so it's an opportunity. White nationalists believe that they speak for white America more than multiracial America, and that's simply untrue. It's not a scarcity model. This is a model of abundance, of creativity and imagination. I want every single white person who wants to live in America that actually cares about their children, that cares about the roof, their job, their health care, to have a place to come to. And it is this place. It's where we all belong. The third is stop telling defeatist stories, right? We have to stop being the Eeyores, right, of the world. We have accomplished too much. Those who came before us have sacrificed much. I look at the streets every night across America and I see young people putting their bodies on the line, right? That is not a defeatist narrative. It is a narrative of people who are courageous, people who love their country and wanted to live up to its highest aspirations. We have the moral authority. We just need the moral will. And we find it by understanding we are winning, not losing.
Beautiful. Let me ask you, we're almost at the end of our time. Let me see if anybody wants to do just a final quick comment, and then I'll close this up. But this has been such an important conversation. Anybody have some final words you want to share, Aneelah?
Yeah, I wanted to say, adding to what Eric and Reverend Brown and what Rabbi Kinberg said as well, you know, the one other thing to keep in mind is look at the changing face of Congress. You know, people like yourself, Congresswoman Jayapal, and so many others, that alone should inspire us. That alone should give us that like ability to say, look, that came from organizing. That came from people coming together, building the kind of movements that we need, and we need much more of that. We can actually change Congress further and have it actually reflect American society. That is something that we can truly achieve together. So it's so important to vote. It's so important to be engaged in the process. And again, not to fall into despair. I also want to point out that when we talk about white supremacy, I want to be very clear that we're not talking about white people. This is not a white or person of color sort of conflict or divide, because that's another divide that would be a tool of white supremacy. It is a system that we are challenging. And there are, unfortunately, people of color who seek to benefit from that system, from that power structure and the illusion of power that they seek to obtain, just as much as there are white people who challenge white supremacy as a system and institution. So this should not be seen as a divide between white people and people of color. This is a systemic issue, an institutional issue that we should collectively come together to challenge. And then finally, my point is, I hope everybody in the work that they're doing, that you do it at least in large part driven by self-interest. And I say that because I love the quote from Leela Watson, who's the indigenous activist, who said, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And that's truly, we have to see this as our collective liberation, not just, oh, I'm helping out, you know, Black people, or oh, I'm helping out Muslims, or I'm helping out the LGBTQ community. You cannot have that kind of mindset. We have to understand how interconnected these issues are and how our work on challenging the systems of oppression in fact benefit each one of us individually as well as all of us collectively as a country.
Fantastic. Anybody else, some final thoughts?
That was Perfect.
Okay, well, let me just offer a few closing thoughts that this panel has made me think about. Number one, as I was listening to you, Eric, talk about you know, bringing white folks into our movements, I was reminded of some research that we just had presented to us yesterday in the Progressive Caucus, but just recently done by the Rand Corporation, and it looks at how much wealth has been transferred from working people to the top 5% in this country. $4.3 trillion over the last several decades that's been transferred. And one of the interesting things was that the gap between rich and poor was always very great for people of color. And that gap stayed very great. But the gap increased dramatically. This was one of the first studies to look not only at the wealthiest and the poorest, but the people in between, you know, all the income quartiles in between. And the gap for white men increased dramatically. So white men lost a lot of wealth in the middle that went to the people at the very top. And it gave me just a reminder again about one of the ideas we started this conversation with. I think Aneelah mentioned at the very beginning that, you know, when you have economic scarcity, when you have all of these divisions are really designed to keep a power structure in place that benefits very few people. And you can see that in this transfer of wealth, but you also see a lot of the economic populism that has been underlying the movement for voters who voted for Trump. And I think that it's an important thing for us to keep in mind that there are a lot of people suffering, and certainly during COVID, there's a lot of people suffering. That doesn't take away the need to focus on white supremacy as a key underlying system of oppression that that is directed at people of color, at Jews, at Muslims, etc. But I think it's an important concept to keep in mind. Second, thinking about this idea of evil around us, you know, and how do we have hope? People always say to me, how do we have hope, Congresswoman? My husband calls me the hope dispenser because I run around dispensing hope like I dispense soap, you know, just trying to hand it out to people. Yes, people, we're in this, we can do it. And it just reminds me of when I was listening to Brittany Howard from the Alabama Shakes, and she had her new album. And she was talking about evil rupturing around, and it was a very serious conversation on NPR. She talked about the ruptures of evil. And what occurred to me in that moment was the picture of rupture. I think of an earthquake. I think of something breaking through the ground and the ground rupturing and this hot lava or whatever it is coming up. And what happens when you have those ruptures is you can actually see evil. If evil is rupturing, you can see evil, perhaps in a way that it wasn't visible to you before. Perhaps it was underground, it was hidden before, but it was there. It's not that it wasn't there. Now it's ruptured and it's come into the open. And what happens when something is in the open? We can see it more clearly. And that means we can organize against it more clearly by naming it. And I think so much of what all of you have said tonight is about that naming, that educating, and then uniting to create a different vision. Which brings me to the third point, which is, you know, I got elected the night that Donald Trump got elected. So I have only served in Congress under a Donald Trump presidency, or alongside, let me say, alongside a Donald Trump presidency. And I've always said that, yes, we are the resistance, we have been the resistance, we are an opposition party, but we cannot just be an opposition party. Being an opposition party does not inspire anybody towards greatness. We have to be a proposition party. And when we are a proposition party, we paint a vision of a world that can be and must be, and we call people into that vision. And that is the proposition of justice in the world, a world that does not have white supremacy littered throughout it, a world where all of us see our worth and our dignity and are given the tools to bring that best self to everything that we do. And that is how I feel about each one of you on this panel. Just so grateful for your leadership, so grateful for your education on this important topic. So grateful for the work that you are doing every single day in your community as leaders, and bringing people into our movement for justice and building those multi-ethnic, multi-gender, multi-generational, multi-racial, multi-everything coalitions so that we understand how deeply, truly deeply interconnected and intertwined our liberation is with each other. So thank you all so much for being on the panel. Thank you to everybody who was listening and who signed up, and let's continue to bring that goodness and that justice. And Reverend Brown, we are coming down to dance with you. So, you know, as soon as we'll bring our masks, we'll be socially distanced, or maybe we just have to wait until COVID's done, or we'll just have a dance party right here on Zoom. Everybody
Yes.
in? All right.
I'm in. I'm so
All right. Have a great night, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.